Dove. She was the only woman standing at the graveside, who nobody offered an umbrella to, even though the rain had been falling in cold, sideways sheets since before dawn. Rosalind Cutter stood at the edge of the freshly dug earth and let the water run down the back of her neck, soaking through the collar of her black dress because there was nobody left in Harrow Creek, Wyoming, to care whether she caught her death of cold. The other mourners clustered under a forest of dark umbrellas at the opposite end of the churchyard, far enough away to make the message plain without anyone having to say a word. She was 24 years old, and she had already been tried and convicted by every pair of eyes in this town, none of which had ever once looked at the actual evidence. The evidence, such as it was, amounted to this. Her husband of 14 months, Douglas Cutter, had been the land agent for the Harrow Creek Cattle Cooperative. 3 weeks ago, Douglas had ridden out to survey the eastern grazing parcels and never come back. When the search party found his horse wandering riderless near the Powder River crossing, they followed the tracks and discovered Douglas face down in the shallows, a gash on the back of his skull that the county coroner, a man named Pell, who smelled of turpentine and rushed his work, attributed to a fall from the saddle. The cooperative's land deed registry, which Douglas had been carrying in his saddlebag, was gone. So were the signed transfer papers for 11,000 acres of prime grazing land the cooperative had been trying to purchase from the federal land office. Without those documents, the sale could not proceed. Without the sale, the cooperative could not expand. Without expansion, a dozen ranching families stood to lose the contracts they'd already signed with the beef traders out of Cheyenne. The town needed someone to blame. Rosalind was right there. She had no family in Harrow Creek. She had met Douglas when he passed through Laramie 2 years ago, charming and broad-shouldered, and she had followed him north like a fool in love. Her only friend in the territory had been Mrs. Agnes Peel, the schoolteacher, who had appeared at Rosalind's door 3 days after Douglas's body was found and pressed her hand and said quietly that she believed Rosalind completely, before her husband appeared at the garden gate to collect her, and she had not come back since. So Rosalind stood alone in the rain and listened to the Reverend speak her husband's name like it was a word he'd rather not have in his mouth, and she told herself she was not going to cry, because crying in front of these people felt like giving them something they hadn't earned. She almost made it. It was the sound that undid her, not the Reverend's words, not the wet thud of the first shovelful of earth, but the creak of the churchyard gate opening behind her. She turned, half expecting it to be another late-arriving mourner, come to stand at a safe distance. Instead, a man stepped through the gap in the iron fence who looked like he had walked directly out of the open country and hadn't stopped to reckon with the existence of towns. He was tall in a way that didn't announce itself, the kind of tall you only noticed when he moved, and everything around him rearranged itself accordingly. His coat was oilskin, dark with rain, and beneath it he wore the worn canvas and heavy leather of a working man, not a ranching man, but a man whose work happened well outside the boundaries of anyone's fence line. A surveyor's satchel hung from one shoulder. His jaw was unshaven by about a week, and his eyes, when they found her across the distance of the churchyard, were the quiet gray of creek water before a storm. He didn't go to the cluster of umbrellas. He walked the perimeter of the yard in long, unhurried strides, and he came to stand beside Rosalind in the rain. She stared at him. He looked at the grave. "You're Douglas Cutter's wife," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I was," Rosalind said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. The rain drummed against his shoulders without seeming to bother him at all. "Name's Fletcher Cain. I was hired by the federal land office out of Cheyenne to survey the disputed parcels before the transfer went through." He paused. "I rode in yesterday. I've been hearing things around town that don't sit right with me." Rosalind turned to look at him fully. Across the yard, she could see the rigid backs of several cooperative members, turning to observe this exchange, shoulders stiffening, heads tilting toward each other. "You shouldn't stand here," she said, "not next to me. They already think I had something to do with the missing documents. If they see you talking to me, they'll assume you're involved too." Fletcher Cain glanced sideways at her, without moving his head. "I spent 4 years surveying land in the Montana Territory," he said. I've been accused of trespassing by men with rifles, and I've been run out of 3 counties by people who didn't like where their property lines turned out to be. I'm not particularly worried about what the citizens of Harrow Creek assume." He looked back at the grave. "My condolences for your husband." Rosalind looked at the raw earth and said nothing for a moment. "He wasn't a thief," she said, finally. "Whatever they're saying, I know," Fletcher said. She looked at him sharply. "That's why I'm standing here," he said. He didn't say anything else during the burial. He simply stood there, solid and unhurried, and the effect on the assembled mourners was immediate and unmistakable. The whispering dropped several registers. The sideways glances toward Rosalind became glances toward him instead, calculating and wary. A man like Fletcher Cain, visibly employed by a federal office, standing deliberately beside the widow, changed the arithmetic of public condemnation in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. When the service ended, he walked with her to the gate, and she heard clearly the voice of Harlan Goss, who ran the cooperative's finances, say to the man beside him, "What business does a federal surveyor have with her?" Rosalind kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and she walked back through the mud toward the small house at the edge of town that she was already 2 months behind on renting. Fletcher appeared at her door the following morning before she had finished her coffee. She almost didn't open it. The sound of a knock on her door had come to mean something unpleasant. A notice from the cooperative's lawyer, a visit from the sheriff with more questions he'd already decided the answers to, a neighbor who had run out of ways to avoid looking at her and finally given up trying. But something in the cadence of it, 3 knocks, even spaced, patient, made her open the door. Fletcher stood on her porch with mud on his boots and something in his expression that was not quite grim and not quite urgent, but somewhere precisely between the two. He was holding his hat in both hands. "I need to show you something," he said. "And I need to do it before Goss figures out that I've been out to the Powder River crossing." Rosalind stepped back from the door. He came inside and set his satchel on the kitchen table and unfastened the buckle with careful hands. The interior was full of papers, survey maps, measurement logs, tide notes. He moved these aside and lifted out something that had been wrapped in oilcloth and secured with a strip of leather. He laid it on the table and unfolded the cloth without ceremony. It was a notebook. Small, leather-bound, the cover swollen and stiff from water damage. The pages, when Fletcher carefully opened it to the middle, were bloated and brown at the edges. But the center lines of text on each page had survived. The handwriting was cramped and precise. Rosalind recognized it before she even fully registered what she was looking at. She had read that handwriting on grocery lists and letters, and the margins of newspapers for 14 months. "Douglas's field notebook," she said. "I found it caught in the roots of a cottonwood about 40 yards downstream from where they found him," Fletcher said quietly. "There's something else." He reached into the satchel again and produced a single sheet of paper inside a sleeve of clear celluloid, the kind photographers used to protect glass plates. The paper inside was a page torn cleanly from an official-looking form, a land office transfer document. Even through the celluloid, Rosalind could see that it was heavily annotated in pencil, with arrows and circled figures, and at the bottom a notation in Douglas's hand that made her stomach drop. "Acreage totals on recorded plat do not match survey measurements. Discrepancy, approx. 340 acres. See Goss Ledger, Oct entries. Transfer should not proceed." "He found the fraud?" Rosalind whispered. Someone had been slowly filing false plat maps with the land office for 2 years, Fletcher said, his voice low and careful. "It's how land swindles work out here. You inflate the recorded acreage on paper, complete the transfer to a private entity at the inflated valuation, pocket the difference. The cooperative would have paid for 11,000 acres and received closer to 10,600. The missing 400 acres would exist on paper only, routed to shell accounts." He pressed his fingers flat against the table. "Your husband was going to blow the whole thing open." "Who?" Rosalind said, though some cold, quiet part of her already knew. "The plat maps were filed by one agent," Fletcher said. "Harlan Goss countersigned everyone." Rosalind sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her legs simply made the decision without consulting her. "He's been running the cooperative's books for 9 years, she said. long enough to know exactly how the records are organized, which documents need to be in place for a transfer to go through, and which documents could derail the whole scheme if a meticulous land agent happened to notice the right numbers didn't add up. Fletcher looked at her steadily. The documents in Douglas's saddlebag didn't go missing because he took them. They went missing because someone took them off his body after he was already in the water. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a horse went past on the street, and a dog somewhere barked twice and stopped. Douglas's skull, Rosalind said, the gash on the back of his head, Fletcher said, is consistent with a blunt instrument, not a river rock. I spoke with a physician in Cheyenne before I rode up here. The shape of the wound matters. A fall produces a different mark than a strike. He paused. Pell didn't look closely enough, or he didn't want to, or someone told him not to, Rosalind said. Fletcher's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes settled into a harder register. Sheriff Doan has been cooperative leadership's man since before he was elected, he said. I've already seen that much. A sound from the street made them both go still. Rosalind moved to the window and looked through the frost-edged glass. Two men were standing outside the mercantile across the road, not doing anything in particular, and yet positioned with the particular quality of stillness that was not idle but deliberate. One of them was looking at her house. How long were you at the river crossing before you came into town? She asked. Most of yesterday morning. Then someone saw you out there. She turned from the window. Goss will know by tonight if he doesn't already. Fletcher picked up the oilcloth and the celluloid sleeve and put them back into the satchel with the same careful efficiency with which he'd removed them. Then we don't stay in town tonight. Rosalind looked at him. We. He met her eyes. I'm a federal land office surveyor, he said, which means I have the legal standing to flag a fraudulent transfer and compel an investigation. What I don't have is a witness who knew Douglas's handwriting, knew his methods, and can testify to the accuracy of what's in this notebook. He buckled the satchel. That's you. You're asking me to go with you to Cheyenne. I'm asking you to let me take the evidence to the regional land office and to come with me so that your testimony arrives alongside it. He held her gaze without pressure or performance. I won't force anything. You know what staying here looks like. Rosalind knew exactly what staying here looked like. It looked like the churchyard in the rain. Dove. It looked like a door that nobody knocked on except with bad news. It looked like a trial she was never going to get to defend herself in, because the verdict had already been handed down in the social machinery of a town that needed its story to be simple. She stood up and went to the bedroom and took her father's watch off the nightstand. Dove. She took the wool coat from the hook by the door and the small wooden box from under the bed that contained the only money she had left, which was not much. She came back into the kitchen and picked up her coffee cup and finished it standing up. I'll need 10 minutes, she said. Dove. They left before noon, taking the back route behind the livery, and they had been riding for less than 2 hours before Rosalind heard, faintly, the sound of hoofbeats behind them, multiplying in the way that hoofbeats did when several horses were pushed to the same pace by riders in a hurry. Fletcher heard it too. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed, and he nudged his horse off the main track onto a narrower path that cut through a stand of cottonwood. Rosalind followed without asking, bending low over her horse's neck to clear the branches. They pushed hard for the better part of an hour through broken country, leaving the track entirely, crossing a shallow creek twice, until the sounds behind them thinned and then fell away. Fletcher finally slowed when they reached the base of a long ridge, and the horses were blowing hard. They'll pick up the trail eventually, he said. We need higher ground and a place to wait out the dark. They made camp in a shallow draw below the ridgeline, out of the wind, where Fletcher built a fire small enough to give heat, without throwing light any distance worth worrying about. Rosalind sat close to it with her hands around her knees and tried to take inventory of her situation, which was not the kind of inventory that yielded comforting results. She was on the run, in the dark, in the Wyoming uplands in October, on the word of a man she had met less than 2 days ago. Tell me why you're doing this, she said, not accusingly. She genuinely needed to understand it. Fletcher was on the other side of the fire, checking the buckles on the saddlebags. He didn't look up immediately. I got into surveying because I thought it was clean work, he said. Numbers don't lie. Measurements don't have opinions. You set the chain at the corner post. You record what you find. The land is what it is. He set the bag down. I've been doing this long enough to know that the numbers get lied about, that the chain gets moved, that the men who should be recording what they find are sometimes recording what they've been paid to find instead. He looked across the fire at her. I came to Harrow Creek to do a routine verification survey, and instead I found a dead land agent in a river and a town busy convicting his wife because it was easier than asking who actually benefited from the missing documents. He paused. I've looked the other way once before, on a job in Nebraska because it wasn't my jurisdiction, and the man involved had friends in the state office. I've thought about it a lot since then. Rosalind watched the fire for a while. Douglas used to say that the land doesn't care who owns it on paper, she said. He said it just sits there and keeps being itself regardless of what any deed says. He was right, Fletcher said. He was a good man, Rosalind said, and her voice stayed steady, which surprised her. He wasn't exciting, and he wasn't bold, and he sometimes forgot things I'd told him twice already. But he was honest the way some people are just constitutionally honest, where it never even occurred to him to do it another way. She looked up from the fire. He deserves to have his name right. Fletcher met her eyes across the low flames. That's why we're going to Cheyenne, he said. They were 3 hours from the city when they rode into trouble. Not behind them this time, but ahead. The trail narrowed as it descended through a dry gulch, and at the narrowest point, where the walls of the gulch pressed close on both sides, 2 riders sat blocking the path. One of them Rosalind recognized from town, Kelsey Dodd, one of Goss's men, who did odd jobs that nobody asked specific questions about. The other she didn't know. Fletcher pulled up smooth and easy. He didn't reach for the rifle in the saddle scabbard, didn't shift his posture into anything confrontational. He just stopped. Goss wants the notebook, the man she didn't know said. Goss can present his concerns to the regional land office in Cheyenne, Fletcher replied, which is where I'm headed. You can go wherever you like, Dodd said, not quite looking at Rosalind. She comes back with us. Rosalind's hands tightened on the reins, but her voice came out level. My husband found your employer falsifying land records and was murdered for it, she said. That notebook goes to the federal land office, and so do I. If you stop us, you become accessories to what Harlan Goss has already done. Think carefully about whether 9 years of employment is worth a federal charge. Dodd's jaw worked. He glanced at the man beside him. Cheyenne has a telegraph office, Fletcher said pleasantly. I sent a wire from the last station we passed, 12 miles back, describing the documents in my possession and naming the individuals implicated in the plat fraud. I also described the 2 men I expected might try to intercept us before we arrived, based on descriptions provided by witnesses in Harrow Creek. He held Dodd's gaze without blinking. The wire has already been received. Whatever happens on this trail in the next 10 minutes has already been reported. There was a long silence in the gulch. A hawk turned overhead. Somewhere down the slope, water ran over rocks. Dodd pulled his horse aside. Puff. They rode through without another word. Rosalind didn't breathe properly until they were clear of the gulch walls, and the land opened up around them again. Was that true, she asked. The telegraph wire? Fletcher glanced sideways at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. I sent a wire. It described the documents accurately and named Harlan Goss. He paused. It did not specifically describe those 2 men. I didn't know which men Goss would send. You gambled. I made an informed assessment, he said. They reached Cheyenne 2 hours later. The regional land office was a stone building on the north side of the main street, solid and institutional, with federal seals on the glass of the front door. The senior agent, a careful-faced man named Aldous Burr, who had been in the land office for 20 years, read the contents of Douglas's notebook with the kind of absolute stillness that meant the contents were having their intended effect. He read the annotated transfer document twice. He asked Rosalind 3 questions about Douglas' methodology and handwriting. Precise questions that told her he already understood what he was looking at. He asked Fletcher 4 questions about the survey discrepancies and the chain of custody for the documents. Then he looked up and said, I'll have a federal marshal in Harrow Creek within the week. Harlan Goss was arrested 11 days later at his desk in the cooperative offices, according to a letter that Mrs. Agnes Peel wrote to Rosalind in Cheyenne, where Rosalind was staying at the women's boarding house on Cary Avenue, while the land office completed its investigation. The letter said that Goss had gone very pale when the marshal walked in, and had not said a single word the entire time they were there, and that Sheriff Doane, who had been interviewed by federal deputies for the better part of a day, had subsequently tendered his resignation. A replacement was being discussed. The letter also mentioned that a number of people in town had expressed, in various forms, that they had never really believed Rosalind was involved. Rosalind read that part twice and then folded the letter neatly and set it on the windowsill. Douglas's name was formally cleared by the land office's published findings, which described him as a cooperative agent who had identified and was preparing to report significant evidence of fraud and had been killed before he could do so. The findings were reported in the Cheyenne newspaper and, she was told, in the Harrow Creek Courier as well, on the front page, below the fold. Fletcher came to tell her in person. He knocked on the door of the boarding house with the same even, patient cadence she had recognized on her own door in Harrow Creek, which she understood now was simply how he did things, without rushing, without performing. She opened the door, and he stood there with his hat in his hand and the Cheyenne wind pushing at the collar of his oilskin coat, and he said, "It's done. The findings are published. His name is clean." Rosalind felt something in her chest that had been held rigid for 3 weeks release in a long, slow exhale. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, because the sudden absence of the weight she'd been carrying made her feel briefly unsteady. "Thank you," she said. The words were insufficient. She said them anyway. Fletcher turned his hat slowly in his hands. He looked at her with those creek-water eyes, and there was in his expression the same quality of directness that had been there from the beginning. No performance, no maneuvering, no calculation about what she might want to hear. "I have a survey contract in Colorado starting in April," he said. "The San Luis Valley. It's long work, 6 months at least, and most of it is in open country." He paused. "I thought you might want to know that the land office in Pueblo is hiring, if Harrow Creek isn't where you intend to go back to." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and clear over the Wyoming plains that stretched out behind him, endless and unbiased as a measurement taken honestly. "No," she said. "Harrow Creek isn't where I'm going back to." She wasn't the woman who had stood alone in the rain at the churchyard anymore. She wasn't the widow who'd been tried in whispers and convicted by the distance between herself and the nearest umbrella. The town that had made her small was 100 miles north, and what it thought of her no longer had any particular weight. She reached for her coat from the hook by the door. "Show me the survey map," she said.